Okay, so hello everybody and welcome to Teen Parent Representation in Graphic Art. This is a 1 hour webinar that we're holding tonight as part of the Michigan Youth Parenting Awareness Day activities. The official MyPad Day for 2019 was this past Friday, March 22nd. It's always the fourth Friday in March. We've done a couple different things for it this year, and this is our last one to round out the month. But for those who may be unfamiliar, Michigan Youth Parenting Awareness Day is an annual awareness day celebrating and honoring parents in the state of Michigan as they work toward their personal goals while building happy, healthy, and thriving families. So one of the things that we've previously done for awareness days is do some type of virtual book club where we'd read something which was related to our awareness day and then have kind of an informal discussion about the different themes and content of it. This year, as we were brainstorming what works we might look at, I had recommended to me this comic book called The Amazing True Story of a Teenage Single Mom.
Oh, wow.
So we decided, yeah, what a great one to go with. This is a format that we hadn't really done before, but I'm very intrigued by the graphic novel. And as I was thinking through, okay, great, we have representation of teen moms, which is very important, but one thing we don't always get is representation from teen dads as well. And I think the Michigan Adolescent Pregnancy and Parenting Program is a program we have here in Michigan, which does amazing work trying to engage young fathers. And through that program, I was able to meet Cole Williams, who's on the call today. He's going to be our guest speaker. And last year at our You Thrive Teen Parent Summit, which is a statewide event for young parents, was introduced to some of the graphic art that Cole is doing, looking at teen dads and portraying them as superheroes and really doing some wonderful representation and creating stories that young Black boys can really connect with. So I thought this is a great tie-in. And so I'm excited to have you on our call today.
Excited to be here.
Yeah, so I figure how we'll kind of do this next 50 minutes or so is I'd like to start with you, Cole. If you could tell us a bit about your project, The Fatherhood. We could look at some of the images you've created around that, and then we'll save some time at the end to go through a graphic novel discussion as well.
Okay, sounds good. Well, I'm, really honored again to be able to have the opportunity to talk about what's really important to me. And again, it's having these conversations around boys of color and men of color, and really finding opportunities and ways to talk about them in media print, but also, most importantly, showcasing them in positive light. So the graphic novel concept really came from just working with men of color and discovering that many of them didn't recognize or even saw themselves as like superheroes. And quite often when working with young fathers and dads in general, they don't typically see themselves out of that lens. But we know that when we're working with children, children see fathers as superheroes. And so I really wanted to begin to change the narrative around how we see boys and men of color by primarily focusing in on natural super strengths that fathers naturally come with, but sometimes aren't aware that they have those kind of superpowers. And so this league of fathers was sort of created out of not only my experience of being a young teenage dad at 16 and then being a single dad at 17, but it just kind of morphed out of my experiences of sort of seeing other fathers that I've worked with, or fathers in general that I've come in passing with throughout my life. And I thought, well, man, how do we showcase and tell the stories of all these amazing fathers that I come in contact with that the world doesn't necessarily see? And so the graphic novel idea was created, and I have 7 fathers that are specifically, they're similar to dads that I actually know. So it's really great to be able to talk about fathers in a way that I'm really hoping will shine a light on all of the great things that dads bring to the table.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I love the concept. Is there anything I can pull up out of the files you sent me that we can take a closer look at?
Yeah, you know what? It might be good to maybe just start with the maybe the intro of I'm trying to think, the intro letter that maybe kind of talks a little bit about what the league is about, and so maybe I can talk a little bit about what this league is of superheroes.
Okay, give me just a moment. I'll share my screen and make sure to pull up what we're looking at here. Let's see. I've got my desktop.
Yeah, and what this is actually a one pager. And this one pager actually just describes the graphic novel. And so the graphic novel actually starts with, instead of calling them the League of Extraordinary Fathers, we're going to just talk about them being the fatherhood.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a graphic novel that really begins to talk about a young dad who, and we're calling this young father Diamante. And so Diamante is 18 years old. And what he's discovering as a young father is that dads are kind of going missing. And so what started to happen is that as Diamante was growing up, his father wasn't involved in his life. And he wasn't really for sure why his dad wasn't involved. But his dad did something really interesting during the time when Diamante was quite young. His dad introduced him to a barbershop. And so this graphic novel really starts and is explored in the world of the African American barbershop for boys and men of color. And so this league had to be brought back together because there was a growing threat in the community, and the threat was this system. And what was starting to happen were boys and men were starting to disappear. And so that is the beginning storyline of why this graphic novel was really created out of, to be honest, reality is that what we're noticing is that boys and men of color are in so many different ways disappearing, and it might be in stereotypes, it might be in just negative imagery, it is in all kinds of ways. Boys are going missing due to other narratives that don't necessarily support the positive narratives of boys and men of color. And so this league sort of comes together, and all of the men that are involved in this league happen to be fathers who have these natural superpowers. And so, yeah, it says a senior high school star athlete, Diamante, I can't, really difficult to read a little bit, has his world turned upside down when his girlfriend gives birth to a baby girl. Now he's 18 years old and he's navigating fatherhood while trying to finish high school with a college GPA of a 3 with a college GPA. On top of that, his father, Derek, suddenly returns home after 12 years of mysterious absence, and Diamante must decide whether or not he can trust a man who has been gone for 2/3 of his life. And so that's really kind of the concept here, is that it's a journey of a young man sort of finding himself in a world that showcases boys and men of color as not being present or not being around. And there's a quote in here that I really love. It says, "The child that is not embraced by a village will burn it down to feel its warmth." Mm-hmm. And I think in personal work, so much of what I'm starting to see is that children will do anything to feel connected to the community. And so I'm really hoping that this graphic novel will be a bridge to boys of color, but also men of color who will, take an opportunity to share their experiences and share their journeys with boys. And so together they will collectively be able to share their narratives, and we find a better way to tell the stories authentically of boys and men of color. And so that's the concept and the idea around this graphic novel. So yeah, this is the I can't even think of what they call this. This is the cover letter, the one page, the pitch, because the next step is what I'm really hoping to do is create some investments that can really sort of help me tell this story and create this graphic novel. So the graphic novel will be a 422 page stories of young men of color and fathers.
So what inspired you to kind of use this as a medium for this story?
I think because I don't see it. So part of the reason why I wanted to create a story that talked about young dads was specifically in the realm of graphic novels, is because I didn't see us represented there. But not only that, I understand by working with young men inside the juvenile detention center, many of our young men aren't necessarily reading, and we also know that so much of what we can learn about literature or learn about literacy has to come from we've got just so many a lack of young men being able to proficiently read at a certain reading level. And so I figure one of the things that we could do is create a graphic novel that supported young men in reading, but most importantly have powerful images that represented us in a very positive light. And so I just wanted positive representation.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Would you mind if we delved into a few of these images a little closer? Let me see if I can pull up some of the ones you shared. Let's see. I think this.
Yeah, and so this image actually is of the protagonist Diamante, and this is him and his daughter. And one of the things I wanted to do is create images that provoked emotion, because one of the things we do know is that it's often said that men don't, they operate out of two emotions. But I wanted to begin to highlight that men who become fathers, no matter what age, develop they develop emotions for children in terms of attachment as well. And so I wanted to create images that really showed a positive spin on teen dads. And so what I find it being a young dad at one point in my journey is that there really weren't any positive images of a teen dad. And so I really wanted to begin to showcase, dads can be involved, dads can be present, despite their age. Once with the right support, they can do anything. And so this is a great image of Diamante.
Mm-hmm. And then is this also Diamante here?
Yeah, and this is also Diamante and his father. And so again, a lot of these characters are created specifically out of experiences that I've had. So in the kitchen, teaching my sons how to cook, and trusting that what what I've taught them they'll be able to do. So it's really interesting to again sort of see these images of dads and their children and normal behavior or experiences, but they often aren't showcased in anything associated with graphic novels.
Mm-hmm. See if there's a few other. I know you've got a number of different kind of members of the fatherhood league that come up, and you've given them particular abilities. I can pick to anyone you want, or just kind of
that's good. So for example, this is Weatherman here, and so Weatherman, I created him, and his profession is a social worker, but Weatherman represents he manages the emotional storms of his children. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what does it mean to have, and he actually has twins. So to talk about what does it mean to, as a man of color, to have children, and you're juggling your own emotions, you're juggling work, but you're also trying to find creative ways to support your children emotionally. And so for me, this is really talking about psychological safety. And so a lot of my work will be with this character to really begin to talk about what is psychological safety, what is emotional safety for children, and how can fathers create those safe spaces, not just the physical space that we often create, but how do we create emotional safe spaces for children to grow and thrive in. And so Weatherman will represent that aspect of a father.
Very cool.
Yeah, and this is JT, Jack of all trades. But what I really appreciate about him is a lot of my work too has been with attachment and really helping dads understand the important role of attachment and skin-to-skin contact. And so I wanted to begin to unpack what is skin-to-skin contact, how does that fit into attachment, and how can dads even support moms when it comes to breastfeeding as well. So JT will represent that spectrum or that conversation around dads and breastfeeding, but dads and attachment. And so this is just one of those images. And then I love multiple man here. Multiple men is just like many dads that I know. They often have to be in more than one place at one time, and oh, we wish we could. So here you see multiple man playing chess with his son, but also at his father-daughter dance, while doing all this at the same time, right? And so again, I want to talk to dads around this idea that yes, we can't be in multiple places at the same time, but when we are in those places with our children, that we must be emotionally um, available, and we must be present. And so as you can see with multiple man, in both instances, you can see that he's emotionally engaged and involved in his expression with his children. And so I'm a firm believer that, we can't just do things with our kids, but we have to also be fully mindfully engaged in the present with them. So this is just another image of what that will look like as we tell the story.
And then I believe this next image is this, an agent of the system, kind of the.
This is an agent of the system.
Okay.
And we call him the enforcer. And as you can see in the background, he has incarcerated both young and old men of color, and he is half machine and half man. And so and he also has children, but we don't showcase this in this image, but we'll begin to talk about the internal struggles that go on, in particular when we have men of color who are police officers, and the internal battle that they might experience or feel as it relates to serving the community, but also being wearing the badge, and how that impacts certain men who are in those roles, and then the experience that they might feel as it relates to serving their communities. And so this will be, I think it's definitely a controversial image, but I think it's really important to showcase and begin to talk about some of those very tough things that we're experiencing in our community. So yeah. And here again is Weatherman. I'm a firm believer in talking about reading and literacy. And so here, and what I love about this is that Weatherman is reading a book that actually has my grandson and my son's image on it, and it says The Adventures of Jonathan and Dad. So yeah, that's actually a book that my son hasn't written, but we wanted to put that image in there to begin to talk about, of course, legacy, but most importantly, the importance of fathers doing what they naturally do. Fathers do sit and read with their children, and they do tuck their children in at night for bed, and they do spend quality time with them. And I think that this is, again, another positive image that sort of reshapes how we see fathers in general.
I love that you put in. I was wondering about that back at this image. We have that image of a laptop in the background, and I was wondering if this is kind of an avatar for you in a way.
Yeah, it's so funny. in so many ways, and what's even more interesting is the laptop in the image. In the laptop is the barbershop, and so again, it's that representation of what does the barbershop represent for men of color. When you enter that space, how is toxic masculinity impacted by it? Who gets to enter into the barbershop and feel safe? Can anybody feel safe in that space? And, I really want to begin to unpack what that looks like. Because I'm learning as I continue to do this work, where at one point I thought, oh yeah, anyone who enters into the barbershop can feel safe. But I'm also learning that there are a lot of people that enter into the barbershop, specifically in the LGBT community, who don't necessarily feel safe in those spaces. And so, beginning to have another, again, in-depth conversation of who gets to fit into these spaces when it comes to men of color, and what can we do to tell those narratives and those stories as well.
I really appreciate all the intersectional issues that you've brought into this. As you say, I mean, we're looking at teen parenthood, we're looking at juvenile justice, we're looking at, poverty and systemic inequities. We're looking at different identities. We're looking at concepts of masculinity and the relationships between men and the intergenerational flow. I mean, it's so layered and rich.
Yeah.
And so I just want to end on this, another barbershop image, it looks like.
Yeah. And I love this image because actually this is a representation of my barber, and the logo that's on the cloth, of this little guy who actually happens to be, these two boys in this image are the barber's sons, but this is actually my barber's, his real logo that he uses, in his work currently. And I think the barbershop is so important as it relates to boys, because one of the things that we started to notice is that when little boys often enter into the barbershop, sometimes they can get agitated and irritated, and they might emotionally get really upset and start to cry. And there was one particular instance where I saw this happening, and a dad was also a little agitated because his son wouldn't stop crying. And I noticed as a bystander, what can I do to support dad for not, to keep him from being so agitated, but to encourage him to recognize that there's something happening in the barber chair for a little boy, and that would kind of make him cry if you think about it. And I thought this image was great to showcase, because one of the things you don't see is that you don't see the child's hands, you don't see any of his body parts because they're covered. There's a cape that's wrapped around his neck pretty tight. There's this loud sound that's buzzing towards his ear and around his ear that could start, some irritation or just some discomfort. And so to talk a little bit about what happens when men and boys are in spaces where they don't have access or can't see parts of their body, and what happens when the barber, who we in so many ways in the African American community see as someone, as a therapist for many men, what happens when you enter into that space. And then to talk about the barber and if a barber does come in contact with so many people, we have to begin to ask questions. How are barbers, how would I describe this? How are barbers' mental health? So can a barber who enters into the space and have seen and heard the stories of so many, trials and tribulations, or have seen, tragic things happen within the barbershop, how are barbers receiving mental health, and how is the barber's mental health? And so to really talk about, again, some real challenging issues that men of color are facing, and that's stress, and that's post-traumatic trauma, and all of that can happen in a barber chair.
Sure.
So,
and secondary trauma, as you say. I feel
absolutely.
People in the helping professions, whether or not they're trained social workers, barbers, bartenders, waitresses, things like that, receive a lot of people's, emotional stuff on a day-to-day basis. And how it is to hold that for people. And it becomes an integral part of the job, whether or not you kind of signed on for it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
How do you continue to do that? How do you sustain that and still, are able to create safety and emotional boundaries for you doing this work?
Yeah.
I imagine you could lead a master class in that with the work that you do, working with young men and incarcerated youth.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and also with this image, to show a playful, positive side too, that at the end of the day, boys and men of color are human, and they do matter. And I'm really hoping that this graphic novel will authentically tell the stories of men of color in very I guess in very diverse ways. So we are men of color, but we all don't share the same. I'm trying to figure out the word, but we're just as diverse and in our own rights. And so I think that creating these images and telling these narratives will really kind of showcase for me how important it is that we don't look at men of color and boys of color as one-sided, but as complex as human nature and humans are, and kind of telling that in a way that is non-threatening, but also fun.
Yeah.
So
No, I'm very excited about what you've already created. I love to see how this project progresses with the narrative. Would you tell people a little bit more about like where you are in the process?
Yeah,
And
so
maybe, you know, where to go from here?
yeah, so one of the next steps is the next step right now is that we're trying to find funding to fund this project, and we've got to find what some writers. I need to find a couple of writers as well as some illustrators to sort of really illustrate the story. But there's, I guess, at this stage, we're just in the stage of finding investors who, see this as something really important and want to invest in helping me create this project. And so, what I'm, saying to people, hey, if you're interested in wanting to be an investor, then I can, give my email address. And then, of course, me and my partners who, have created a business plan can sit and talk in detail about, what it would cost for the project, and then how to invest and support us create this. So yeah.
Okay, good. Well, I'll make sure to include your contact info to all of our registrants. So if anybody, has any contacts or feels really moved by this, can follow up, because I'd really like to see this project grow.
Yeah, me too. I'm so excited about it, and yeah, I just know that it will serve a really important purpose, and that purpose is again to change the narrative on how we see men and boys of color in media, but telling their stories in a very authentic, real way.
Cool. Well, I just wanted to open it up for a moment to everybody who's joined us. If you had any questions for Cole about the fatherhood comment, and I also want to address, it looks like somebody's having a sound concern. I think Sade, Amy, or Ellen, did you have any thoughts, comments, questions about the images? I'm curious kind of to know how you, how you got into this kind of like artistically. This is a really amazing skill. So how did you come to design like this?
Yeah, so I am not the artist who created the images. I'm just the writer behind the images.
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
yeah, so the artist who created them is Philip Johnson. You can definitely find him on my Facebook and Instagram page. But what's interesting is I just, I had to search really hard to find him, but once I found him, I really just sent him a script. And it was, as detailed as I could possibly make it in terms of eye color and natural hair, because one of the dads we didn't talk about is Dr. Little, and he has 4 daughters. And so I wanted to really be intentional about how girls of color are showcased in this graphic novel as well. So there were, a lot of amazing women who have also helped me in terms of helping develop the characters, and making sure that I was very intentional about how they were drawn and created. And so Philip was really just amazing in terms of, allowing me to say, hey, this is what I want to see. And then, creating a draw up, and then we're going back and forth around, nope, that's not what I want. This is sort of how I envisioned it. And so it's really just been amazing to sort of have, just to give an artist something that you write, and then they just kind of draw it and bring it to life. So I'm really hoping to continue to have him on the project as we move forward. But really, this was all sort of out of just my experiences of just doing the work with young dads and dads in general. And it just sort of kind of morphed from there. And I tell all my students that I work with, all I did was I bought, got a pad of paper for 39 cents, and I got a free pen from Huntington, and we started writing from there. So things can come true if you write it down. So that's the nuts and bolts of it.
Very cool. Okay, so you got a whole creative team going. That's
Yeah,
great.
absolutely. Yeah, and my partners, I should also say, is I'm working with a film crew by the name of Gorilla, and these guys are amazing. So the pitch deck that I sent you and the one pager was all created with this group of film folks who have they're creative geniuses and have said, hey, we believe in what you're doing, Cole, and we want to support you. And so yeah, now I have a whole team of people that are helping to make this happen.
Mm-hmm. Is there, I mean, for me, this seems entirely new and unique. Is there anything out there kind of like this now, or anything that you draw inspiration from?
There are some, I'm trying to think, there are, oh man, what's the name of it? We've had, like, I think Boondocks is something. A lot of the stuff that we're seeing is more so anime, but not so much the whole fatherhood perspective in graphic novels. I think it's the first, at least from my perspective, of what we've done in terms of research. It is a unique, I think something very unique for that genre of writing. So it'll really be interesting to sort of see how the market receives it. But yeah, I think there's a lot of great stuff out that Netflix has, but nothing like this at this time.
For sure.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I'll leave it open, as I say, for those who are just joining us. This is kind of a very conversational webinar. So we'll be discussing, we just kind of wrapped up a discussion of Cole's project. I will be sending out some of the panels and Cole's information if you want to follow up more and keep tabs on this project, where it's going, invest in it. We're going to switch gears a little bit to start looking at some of the teen mom stories we saw in The Amazing True Story of a Teenage Single Mom. But feel free to jump in at any time and ask questions. All right. So, like I said, everyone should have control of their microphone. So feel free, you can ask questions, verbally, or you can, of course, use the chat feature, which is at the right of your Zoom screen, and we'll keep the conversation going in both those places. So, The Amazing True Story of a Teenage Single Mom. So this was a new one for me. I think there was a great article by Rewire that was talking about 6 different stories that were written by and for teen moms. And we felt like this was a new medium for us, looking at the graphic representation. So if you've read it, amazing. It'll add richness to the discussion. But if you haven't, no worries. We're going to be talking about it, and I'll try to share my screen as much as possible. But my first kick off the discussion question would be, this story is by Catherine Arnoldi, and it's written when she's a little older, and it's looking back as, she was just starting out her journey as a teen mom. She had her daughter Stacy, and she had all these big dreams about, pursuing education. That's a big theme that runs through this. She wanted to go to college, and not necessarily for anything in particular. I think she was very open to saying, I don't know what I want to become yet, is a major theme, but I know that I want to learn more. And so once she has Stacy, the challenge becomes, okay, before I can go to college, there's certain things I need, and finances is one of them. So she starts looking at work. She goes to work in a factory that makes latex gloves. She picks up gigs waitressing, different food establishments, Then it follows her journey into starting to date a man named Dave. They decide to move out west once her job at the factory is disrupted by a strike that goes on and some other workers' rights violations that are happening in the factory. Follows Dave out, the relationship with Dave. I'd like to do a content warning about this book for those who may not read it. There are a few instances of sexual harassment and assault. So those do come up. So for those who are on the call, please take care of yourselves. So her relationship with Dave becomes abusive. She leaves that situation, goes and revisits some memories of her family, goes and reconnects with some family members like her father who haven't been present in her life now, and ultimately manages to connect with another young woman who's taking care of children, who's able to point her in the direction of college experiences that are accessible to her, financial aid options that she didn't know were available to her. She's able to pursue all these different community college courses and kind of feel like she's achieved something she's always wanted to do, which is really just the ability to explore. It's done in a black and white style with these different long panels. Sometimes they're in the 4 quadrants. Sometimes they'll do something that takes up the entire page. So I want to open up the discussion about, why graphic novels? For those who have read it or maybe those who haven't, what do you think it adds to do something in this style versus just, kind of doing your typical written biography?
Well, I think it's the style is very non-threatening, and I think sometimes graphic novels make it much easier for people to maybe even just process. Having the images is also really, really nice for readers. But I think just having something different and unique around how we take in topics that aren't always easy to talk about. I think that a graphic novel sort of really creates a space for it to come across in a much smoother way.
Stephanie, I see. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Hi. No, I was muted. Yeah, I really liked it because I feel like the emotion was just portrayed in such like a strong way. Like when she, got her acceptance letter, that there was like several pages of excitement, or like when like the scenes when she was like talking about like looking at the stars, and I don't know, just like the time of like actually like looking at the whole image, and even using like a page with 4 panels versus 1, like you could just kind of tell how important that moment was, that it wouldn't maybe be portrayed in like that traditional book format.
I wonder, I think there is an approachable quality to it, because I know sometimes like, I'm just not ready to slodge through like this written chapter book about somebody's life. That's a lot. I will say though, it is, in some sense, it is more visceral to have some of these difficult scenes in a graphic depiction. I mean, we reference the sexual assault scenes, and, I feel like those could be very difficult if put into a visual versus written format. However, with that caveat, I think I really appreciated how Catherine did that. And that it wasn't necessarily an explicit, it wasn't explicit how she showed violence. For those who are unfamiliar, she depicts her abusers kind of as monsters. They'll have fur and horn, and their features become very distorted. And so there's still this kind of sense of danger. If I can show really quick, this is Dave, one panel, the relationship that ends up being very abusive. And so there's still this sense of danger, but it's in a way that's approachable, and I didn't find too traumatizing. So the emotional content I felt was very much there with the visuals, but in a way that didn't ask me to kind of hold somebody's trauma too much. I really liked as well, speaking of the emotional content, some of when I think about typical graphic novels I've seen, sometimes they just, for the panels, they just have a kind of a black line box around them. And I loved how she created her own boxes, and they could add like additional context to them. For example, like some of these, they've got the squiggly lines around, and so you can say like, okay, this is her nervous, anxious kind of feeling to it. Over in this one, she has extra words written in to the frame of this panel, which are all about Stacy talking about like, Mom, I'm thirsty, I want a drink of water. And it was just like kids do. So I thought it added kind of scenery to it, without being like too busy. Really neat device she used. Were there other particular graphics that stood out to people, or favorite panels that people had? I'm trying to think of some of the ones that stood out to me. I think definitely, as Stephanie mentioned, when we go from kind of the small quarter panels to the ones that just kind of burst out, at the end, when she meets, I should look up that woman's name. But she meets a woman who tells her about community college and financial aid options, and something she's been working toward this entire time, and she finally gets accepted. You see this kind of like swirl of happiness, and how her kid's a part of that, and it just, kind of continues. And you have a couple pages where there's not even words. It's just these lines of movement and excitement and joy, and it really hits you in a way that I don't think, words could.
Yeah, I think that was my favorite part too. I just remember just getting like all the warm and fuzzies, like seeing how many pages she used. Like I think that was like the most number of pages she used to like describe a single like experience. So you could tell that was like huge,
Mm-hmm. So I definitely want to talk about major moments of joy, but I do want to, because this is this is the teen parent representation in graphic art, I also want to talk about how, because we have a certain stereotype around teen parents that has been perpetuated for years, that is not always the most positive. I want to acknowledge how the author acknowledges that stigma that she's encountered, and how that plays out in her journey as an obstacle, just like all the other obstacles of financial difficulties and, a lack of support, or really unhealthy support from relationships in her life, is kind of this less concrete force, but this idea of shame around teen parenthood that gets put on her. I think about one of the panels here, where she's in bed, and this common phrase that she's heard, that she's made her bed and she has to lie in it. And this idea of blame that comes up. And we learned that, if we're going to describe any blame, her pregnancy is the result of someone taking advantage of her. She describes it as a date rape. And later on, we learned that, it was somebody who offered to give her a ride when she was kicked out of an unhealthy home situation. And so this idea that she had made her bed when really what happened was she was raped is very inaccurate and very difficult thing to be placed on somebody. Other phrases besides "made my bed" and "I have to lie on it" that I find repeated is she mentions a lot of times about people telling her, using the word ruined, that she ruined her life. Yeah, everything was bad. My whole life was ruined. And this feeling of kind of like being done, when all she wants to do is move forward. The phrases she uses for herself over and over is like, I wanted to become what I was going to become. This idea of growing and going on, and how she has to struggle against people kind of writing her off as a done deal.
Yeah, even her dad, who, seems kind of like skeevy anyway, was just like, oh, too bad you have a kid. Now, like, no one will want you, and obviously that's just, like, not the reality. Just like really shaming about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the dad's an interesting character. I think Catherine shows amazing resilience through all of the trials that she has to go through, and, is always, I think, extremely strong and capable, and looking for additional guidance and support to help her through. And her dad is somebody she meets kind of toward the end of her story, who hasn't been present. Her dad left when she was quite young, and she was left under the legal guardianship of her sister, actually, after her mother disowned her. And so at the end, she gets to a city where she knows that her dad is. She knows his name from some old luggage she found in the attic, and thinks like, okay, I'll look him up. He's actually fairly prominent in this city. Like, people know his name. I understand he's doing very well financially. He's fairly connected. And I think I got the sense that she was kind of hoping that he'd be able to be a supportive character, and that doesn't end up to be the case. He ends up to be a mouthpiece for a lot of these really difficult stereotypes that get perpetuated around teen parents. And I got to give her credit, because after encountering that, after everything else she's gone through, was able to kind of be like, nope, I took my bucket to the well, and the well was dry. And, he's my biological father, but he's not the person I need. And he's not the person who's going to serve me. So, yeah. Let's talk about some of the good supportive characters in her life that kind of help her out. Kind of chosen family versus biological family, perhaps. So, was there anybody that, anybody particularly that people enjoyed as kind of like a supporting character to Catherine?
Yeah, I think her roommate Debbie was a big one, before she moved, and then when she finally made it back to Denver, and even when her landlord was like, you can't have kids, she helped her get to a place where she could have her kid there. So I think that was a huge supportive relationship. So, yeah.
Yeah. And then I think the next place she goes from Debbie's is, what was her name? Helen?
Yeah, something like that.
Woman's name. I'll look it up. She references her in a back Jackie, excuse me. Yeah, in the same way, I think Cole was talking about how there's kind of there's a camaraderie amongst men and boys sharing their experiences of masculinity. I think there's some really cool connections that Catherine makes with women who kind of understand her situation. I think about the woman who, when she first got her waitressing job after the factory strike, and she describes not knowing how to do that work and dropping things and being concerned about it, and instead of kind of ridiculing her or being like, you know, you're not going to last here, and again writing her off as like, well, you're not good at this now, therefore you're never going to be good at this, shows her this is how you hold a tray and this is how you take orders, and is able to kind of support her, especially as they're both in this environment that they talk about being really difficult for women. They talk about customers being super demanding. They talk about customers ogling waitresses, trying to tell them that they should wear different clothes and smile more. And so having that kind of female camaraderie, it really comes through.
Yeah, and at her college that she goes to as well, like, you know, she's like, oh, I wouldn't be able to join the equestrian team and whatnot. And someone is like, oh, it's like all young moms on the team too. So I feel like at the actual school, there's a big support system, and her friend that they said they'll trade like babysitting times, and yeah, I feel like, you know, once she's in Denver, things work out pretty well.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the characteristics of Catherine that, or what are some things that kind of show her off as a character, and, you know, her strength and devotion? What makes her a good protagonist, I guess, would be a succinct way to put my question.
In my opinion, she's, you know, really resilient. You know, she definitely, like we talked about, goes through some like tough things. She, you know, deals with sexual assault. She has, you know, an abusive boyfriend. She's like, you know, got fired from her job and whatnot. Yeah. And, you know, and she like, you know, like she's human and has these like hard moments, and it's like, I don't know what I'm gonna do, but she, you know, like I like love how much she like comes back to Stacy and is like, I want a better life for Stacy, so I'm gonna like make this work for myself and for us.
I love how so many of the panels have Stacy as kind of a sidekick figure for her.
Yeah.
That she talks about, you know, having to leave Stacy at daycare or in somebody else's care to provide for her, going to jobs and things like that. But so many other times you see like Stacy on her back or by her side, or she's trying to do things with her. And, you know, those moments of joy are with Stacy, tossing her up, cuddling her. And so it's really lovely to see that love and care there. And, you know, something we hear so much from teen moms that we work with, that there's this level of joy that really needs to be showcased more with all of the struggles and challenges young parents face. You know, they do it because there's this deep-seated love for their children, and they're wanting to be the best version of themselves they can be for their kids, so their kids will have a great life, thrive. I also really loved, I finally found it, they do a panel where they look inside Catherine's brain. Early on, like they look through Stacy's brain, like a baby brain. And then she kind of does a call back to this, looking at her own brain. And I think this is really illustrative of, like, you know, how complex it can be, you know, her worries, you know, what's important to her about Stacy. small things about guilt, faith in there, desires that she has, goofy stuff like rock lyrics that she can't forget, and this really nice diagram of like how multifaceted this role could be. Anyway, there's a lot to unpack with this book. People want to follow up, we can. It is now 8 o'clock, so we'll wrap up here. I'm seeing a quick comment from Ellen that it would be great to hear strategies about how we can use graphic novels. I agree. I think, Cole's discussion tonight really showcases how this medium, I think, lends itself to connections with younger people, and how we get to see a richer, fuller picture of people's experience than perhaps we do in other ways. Cole, any kind of final comments or remarks?
I think what Ellen just said is great, because one of the things that, in addition, that we're hoping to do, not just only create the graphic novel, but we also want to be able to create some curriculum stuff based using using the images that we're creating with this graphic novel, because we understand that there's going to be some tough topics that we're going to tackle, but there are also so many young people that are experiencing some of this. So we want this to be a tool that professionals can use to support boys of color and girls of color as well. So we're right on it when we're talking about creating tools and journals and all those things that will begin to support professionals and working with the population that we hope to serve. So no, that's great. That's great.
Yeah, I love that too. And it's like, think about wearing a facilitator hat. I just feel like everybody learns so differently. Some people, like you were saying, Cole, like some people are more artistic, some, prefer reading or having conversations. And so I just feel like the more, the different forms of media and different ways we're having this conversation, the more people we're going to reach. Which is why I feel like it's cute. I love this expansion into not the traditional ways of sharing these messages and stories.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Cole, for being on, for sharing your work. And thank all of you for listening. As I said, we'll be sending out information to the emails that you used to register for this webinar. Thank you for your time and your presence, and hope everyone has a nice night.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you. Thanks for facilitating, Brittany.
Yeah, thank you, Brittany. Great job.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.